Hello and welcome to London for this edition of Global Questions with me, Zeinab Badawi. Has coronavirus changed our view of what we expect from our leaders? Uncertainty still grips many nations and people are looking critically at how politicians have responded to the pandemic. Will this usher in a new social contract between citizens and governments and help reframe the role of the state? That's coronavirus crisis. Will it change our politics? Well, I'm now inside the BBC's headquarters here in central London, and as always, to bring you this edition of Global Questions, our two panellists and our audience members join us via video link. Let me tell you who's in the hot seat this week. James Graham is an acclaimed British dramatist and playwright. Political discourse has been central to his work since his first big success in 2012 with This House, which was a critical insight into the workings of British politics. He's gone on to produce many film and television dramas on contemporary culture. And Lysa John is Secretary General of CIVICUS. That's the World Alliance for Citizen Participation, and she's based in Johannesburg in South Africa. And CIVICUS is the organisation that's dedicated to strengthening citizen action and civil society around the world. Lysa has spent more than 20 years working on grassroots advocacy, including social justice, human rights and poverty. Great lineup. Welcome to you both, and also to my audience members. And remember, you too can join the conversation. It's hashtag BBC Global Questions. Solitary round of applause from me to you all. Now let's get to our first question straight away, and it is from Borneo in Malaysia, and Dylan Jordan Tan. Dylan.
Hi there. So, with the current health crisis that we're in, unemployment and hunger have increased. So, how do world leaders regain the trust of the people?
How do world leaders regain the trust of the people? Before you answer that, both of you, James, have world leaders lost the trust of their people?
I think a great many of them have, of course. It's not uniform. Every different country has a different relationship with its populace. But I don't think we can pretend that prior to this global outbreak of this pandemic, that the relationship and the contract between citizen and state, certainly in a lot of Western democracies, felt particularly healthy. Speaking to you now from Great Britain, we had really felt we had arrived at a crossroads after the financial crisis of 2008, after the deep divisions of Brexit, and including up to the proroguing of our parliament in 2019. It really felt like ideologically, domestically, politically, economically, intellectually, we had reached a tipping point. And of course, there's nothing like a virus, a global pandemic, to demand that you have to reset certain imbalances within that relationship between citizen and state.
Lysa John, do you agree with James that governments have lost the trust of their people and therefore they have to regain it? And if so, what do they do?
I would love to agree with him, but evidence actually shows otherwise. So you saw that the Edelman Barometer Trust update earlier in May showed us that people were in fact now relying very heavily on governments to do the right thing. So trust in governments actually increased this year, but it has to be followed up by some bold and decisive actions. And that's where I think the crux lies, and the ability of people to continue to trust their governments will depend on whether they actually take on the decisive and transformative changes that people want to see from their governments. There's, again, reports from established global think tanks for this being the one moment in time where we have unprecedented high levels of public expectation from governments to do the right thing. So to really change, what responses have been so far, particularly in tackling inequality and climate change.
All right, let's go now to just outside Durban in South Africa to our next question from Caitlin Michael. Caitlin.
Hi, my question is pretty simple. It's with regards to female leaders and how well they've handled the pandemic, and whether being a female leader and being selected in a female leader is actually a sign of progression of the society as a whole, which has then in turn helped the ease of the pandemic in those countries.
Right. Lysa John, you've got a smile on your face. Is it going to broaden? Because you agree with that women have done it better throughout this coronavirus crisis.
Absolutely. And of course, Caitlin is in Durban and I'm in Johannesburg, so I'm going to agree with her, right? I think there are two trends here. One, of course, we've seen a huge, attention in the media at what women leaders at the global level are doing well. So whether it's Germany or New Zealand or Taiwan, you're seeing women heads of states responding differently to the crisis than particularly their authoritarian counterparts. And I think what this really means in relation to how governments respond is a move and a demand for less of the aggressive masculine tendency of win-lose, domination and aggression, and more of the feminist principle of leadership where you're not only listening to diverse views, but you're actually engaging with dissent and therefore able to create more resilient and adaptive ways of responding to an unprecedented context.
So James, do you think then that voters, people are picking up on this kind of more caring, emotional intelligence aspect that Lysa says women leaders have?
Well, I hope they're picking up on it because it's impossible to deny. Statistically, you cannot escape how effective different countries and different leaders have been in tackling the coronavirus. And it may just be that there are certain kinds of men in traditional Western democracies who tend to rise to the top, particularly at this moment. We are coming out of a moment where populism was raging through Europe and America, where a certain kind of libertarian, masculine leader who often tried to sell very popular and actually quite aggressively simple messages were those who people responded to because they felt like they were anti-politics. They weren't traditionally seen as politicians with a great level of expertise or who had worked in the establishment and had been embedded in the system. So whether that be Boris Johnson, who is a journalist and some would say a television personality, or Donald Trump, who was a reality television star. They were elected, we are told, because they were anti-politics. And they were presenting these quite clear but very simple narratives. And then into this comes a very complicated problem that requires a very complicated solution. And, the evidence speaks for itself, whether you're Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand or Angela Merkel in Germany, who has a background in scientific data analysis. They acknowledge the complexity of this problem and weren't afraid to take unpopular decisions that in the long run benefited their country.
But aren't you all being a bit tough? I mean, men can be compassionate and caring, and some of them have really put their best foot forward, haven't they?
I'm a bloke, and I like to think I'm incredibly in tune with my emotional side, not just because I'm a playwright. And of course, these are vast generalisations. I just think we are coming out of a particular cultural moment where strength was perceived in politics to be a certain kind of, as you identified, a certain kind of masculinity, where changing your mind or for a second admitting that things are complicated and are going to be difficult was not the prominent political characteristic that we had in our leaders. And it's exactly the moment when we needed that kind of non-binary, non-simplistic, non-arbitrary grey thinking.
Caitlin, what do you think about what you've just heard both our panellists say?
I agree with everything everyone is saying, and I feel like also this idea of a softer side being feminine or masculine, and just this continual binary view of characteristics, which I think we should start stepping away from. But what I was really interested in is whether that's actually a reflection of the society and how that society or that the women leaders have been chosen in, whether it's a reflection more on their societies.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Now let's go to East Africa and Uganda to Bidi Khalid. Bidi, your question, please.
Yeah, some governments using COVID-19 to crack down and oppress dissenting voices in their country, and therefore this has embroidered on the dictatorships and loose-race rulers.
All right, so James Graham, this has strengthened the hands then and emboldened the strong men in government. Has it?
It's very interesting to consider the last question, isn't it, in terms of and the difference between the approach of certain governments. There can be no question that in a crisis, the inclination of some governments towards using this as an opportunity to increase their powers or leaning to towards a more authoritarian response of government over their people has always been the case, historically speaking. And there was a spectrum of that. I'm not comparing the response of the UK to what we just heard. But the passage of legislation through the British Parliament in terms of increased powers for the government to be able to respond to the crisis, and also whether it be issues around data and surveillance, the powers and the weapons that our health organisations and bodies and our governments need in terms of tracking us, monitoring us, tracing us. There has been a bit of, I would say, significant lack of scrutiny, understandably, given the urgency of the response. But across the board, I think it's not uncommon to see normal standards of scrutiny and checks and balances slightly disappear. So it is obligated on us as citizens and on you as journalists and on the members of our parliaments and our governments to make sure that once the extremities of this crisis ebb away slightly, that those checks and balances return and we can hold our governments more to account.
Lysa John.
So, the trend really of using the pandemic as an excuse to restrict civic freedoms is really worrying. And in fact, all the directions or the evidence really is of governments not just enforcing temporary measures, but finding ways to make the dilution of democratic systems more permanent. In a lot of countries, journalists are not being allowed to ask questions. Citizens are being punished for speaking out on social media or questioning the methods of government. Attacks on human rights defenders, so activists and journalists, have increased exponentially. Being a journalist now is one of the most dangerous professions in the world, as it was in previous years when we've tracked civic freedoms. And I'm just going to end with one more fact. In over 68 countries around the world this year, governments have postponed elections that were due to happen at national or subnational levels. And that means we really urgently, as citizens, need more substantive ways of engaging with governments rather than just the exercise of our vote, right? And so this has to be a moment in time where we're also reinventing how democracies work and how we're able to then, kind of reinforce the kind of collective good that publics need from governments.
Let us now go to Brazil and André Oliveira.
Hello, I want to ask do you think that free market liberalism has weakened the cooperative ties of our societies and has made politics more selfish, something that the coronavirus pandemic has highlighted?
James, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good and important question. Certainly, certainly in the first instance, temporarily, by default, governments had to put back up borders and cease engagement in a physical sense and a diplomatic sense, and changing how we operate. And I think psychologically, it does feel like the natural extension of a trend that we're seeing borders being rebuilt, sometimes literally in discussions of walls being rebuilt between nations, and a sense of certain governments, I would say certainly Donald Trump's administration, in engendering or trying to engender distrust and mistrust in a lot of our global bodies and our global expertise. I think naturally there's something about the nature of a global pandemic and the speed in which it travels and the universal way in which it travels that I think is forcing a new culture in governments to see themselves as part of a global society that will require huge and ambitious and transformative global solutions, not just in rebuilding the global economy post-pandemic, but also in the challenges we all face as a world. The climate crisis that so dominated our discourse and our headlines and our protest movements in 2019 hasn't gone away. It's been exacerbated, and we need to come up together with our global institutions to find ambitious answers to those questions.
All right, Lysa, how would you answer this question? Has politics become more selfish, inward-looking?
I think it has in the past decades, and there's a very clear nexus between how politics and business have operated. There's in fact been a report by a special rapporteur that was tabled in the Human Rights Council recently, which pointed to 3 trends that have grown exponentially since the 1980s. One is aggressive tax avoidance. The second is the deregulation of labor markets. And the third is the privatization of public services. And all of these three have really combined to put us in the situation we're in now, where we are not only dealing with an extraordinary health crisis, but we're also dealing with a crisis of employment, a crisis of social protection, and a crisis of just inequality that is really coming up to the fore across countries. And I think that really calls again for us to be examining very clearly how our economic and political systems are unfit for purpose at the moment and need to be redesigned with a much stronger level of accountability and oversight from citizens.
You're living in Brazil, and of course, President Bolsonaro has attracted a great deal of attention because after the United States, Brazil is the country that's most affected by COVID-19. Are you seeing a more selfish politics, as you put it, there?
Yes, here in Brazil, we are living, as everybody knows, a country without any kind of leadership during the pandemic. So each state of the country has adopted a politics to face it. So it's everything very uncoordinated around the country, and it makes the situation even worse. So it's something like the president has said, you do whatever you want. I don't have no responsibility over anything.
Right,
and
well, each to his own is what you say is going on in Brazil. Okay, thanks very much indeed for that perspective, Andre. Let's now go to the capital of Sweden, Stockholm, and Leila Trulson. Leila.
Thank you. My question is, what kind of policies or change in politics do you think are needed after going through a pandemic that unproportionately affected working class people as well as people of color, both health-wise as well as financially?
All right, Lysa John.
There's really this urgent sense of desperation and of being left behind by our economic systems that you're seeing across the world. We know that 70 million people, more people will be pushed into extreme poverty, with a large proportion of them from the African continent. And this really calls on both businesses and governments to step up and provide the kind of leadership the world really needs right now. But in addition to that, I would say the ability to protect civic freedoms, because our mechanisms to hold governments and businesses accountable are directly linked to how well we are able to articulate, our concerns, our questions, our ability to express dissent, and to assemble and organize ourselves. We need better, institutions that will hold governments accountable and which will represent the interest of we the people rather than the narrow interest of individual countries as we emerge from this.
All right, James, do you think, the conversation about the change of politics and policies, that has already taken place? When you see the trillions of dollars that are being spent in stimulus packages by Western governments to help people who've lost their jobs, people at the bottom of the pyramid, it's kind of reframing the role of the state and what people expect governments to do, the kind of spending that you would associate mostly with socialist policies. Do you think that transformation has already taken place?
Well, you're right. I mean, certainly in governments like the UK and in Europe and across America, the level of economic intervention has been on a scale we haven't seen almost since the Second World War. But I think the question is, as a result of that and the levels of debt that will be amassed by these governments as a result, who is going to be forced to pay for that? And is that going to result in new waves of austerity? Is that going to result in, therefore, people from lower socio-economic backgrounds and ethnic minorities having to pay the price later down the line because of high levels of public sector cuts? I would hope not, and I would hope that actually, the word that Lysa John used earlier was that I think the scale of our ambition in terms of how we transform our politics is really key here. It's no bad thing, I think, to use the post-war settlement as an example of that, as an example of the scale of ambition that we should be aspiring towards in terms of social, economic, political and cultural reform to meet the huge scale of these challenges. And in terms of how you get how you can make sure that people from working class backgrounds or ethnic minority backgrounds are sort of get a seat at the table is representation. It's amplifying those voices and making sure that they have a seat at the table.
Layla, how would you answer your own question?
I think that this pandemic is putting a light on pre-consisting differences and inequality when it comes to health and finances. But I feel like this has become a more extreme situation. And although I agree that there are stimulation checks and different benefits, etc., going on right now, I also see that they are being distributed in a very unequal way.
People responding on social media about whether the coronavirus has been a game changer for the way we do politics. It seems that a lot of people actually felt that it was going to have a change. And I would say from the response we've had, arguably, that more people think it will bring about positive change. Just give you an idea, maybe people will move away from right-wing authoritarian politics to more progressive ones. I think that we will love more after this coronavirus and become more aware of a lot of things. But other people disagree and think it's making us more selfish and that there'll be more poverty. Others again think that healthcare is going to be promoted much more by politicians and that it's going to lead governments to have a more hands-on approach. So that's a kind of, testing the mood, as it were, on social media. So it gives you an idea. All right, having said that, let us go to Judith Woolley, who is in the UK, in England. Judith, hello.
Hello. My question is, can world leaders accept that the pandemic has to change the way governments work? And are they prepared to do so in order to work with public opinion and each other?
Right, thank you. We've touched on that a little bit. James Graham.
Well, I think we have no choice. I think that the scale of the challenges facing countries domestically and globally are of a scale, and because of the interconnected nature of our economies and our governments now, it will require a global response. And look, I really like actually hearing some of the things that the people said on social media. I'm really glad that somebody used the word love there, and I do think even though you can get sentimental about it. There is something about the scale of this crisis and the unique nature in that it even though it strangely isolated us and put us behind closed doors, I feel like for the first time in a long time, it's actually forced us to see ourselves as part of a collective. Because we had to exercise this level of self-sacrifice for this collective endeavour, whether that's just staying at home and making sure you're not spreading the virus, and becoming aware of the great economic levers of government that are still there and the great action that governments can do in acting big and ambitiously to solve a problem. There's levels of funds there that we just didn't imagine. In this UK, Zeinab, you'll be aware that there's a phrase often used that there is no magic money tree to solve certain problems, whether it comes to inequality. And suddenly we found this magic money forest, and we were able to generate money when we needed it to solve these huge scale problems. So I think actually most citizens, having seen the scale in which governments can act and the speed in which they can act when they're forced to, I think our ambitions for how a government can work together to solve these challenges ahead of us have been raised, and they need to be met.
All right, Lysa John, I mean, the magic money forest, as James Graham has put it, doesn't really exist, though, does it, for lower income and middle income countries? And we're not seeing lots of money being thrown at people who are losing their livelihoods in these countries. They can't borrow at the same level that the richer countries can.
There's quite a strong call right now from the international community for wealthy nations who've thrown in a lot of money to bail out their own communities or to create hefty economic stimulus packages for their own businesses and workers, to also understand that the same needs to be done by the developing nations if we're going to get out of this together. So it's just not going to work for one part of the world to save themselves and the other part of the world not to have the ability to do the same. And therefore, calls that are being made for the immediate cancellation of debt payments from developing countries, which would release a lot of money for countries to domestically step up their support and protection towards their own communities is really important at this time. And I think we really need, therefore, governments to walk the talk in terms of their commitment to deal with the coronavirus pandemic and find a solution, because they're not going to be able to do it in a piecemeal or isolated fashion.
Thank you very much indeed, Lysa John from Civicus, and also to you, James Graham, young, distinguished British playwright, and also to my audience who've been asking questions from all over the world. That's all from this edition of Global Questions. Coronavirus, will it change our politics? I think we have brought you quite an interesting discussion on how we think it is actually transforming politics one way or another. Remember, we are the programme that brings you the trend lines behind the headlines. Thank you to you, wherever you're watching or listening to this programme. From me, Zeinab Badawi, and the rest of the Global Questions team, goodbye.